Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we will learn how to integrate HDevelop machine vision code into an existing Visual Studio project. For this, we will use HDevEngine. HDevEngine is a library that acts as an interpreter. It lets you directly load and execute HDevelop programs and procedures from within your C++, Visual Basic.NET, or C# application. Thus, you don't have to recompile the entire application when making changes to the machine vision code. Let's have a look at the HDevelop program. First, we initialize the program. Then we define the input. We read an image and set a minimum gray value. Next, the actual image processing is done. We apply a simple threshold and compute the connected components. Last, we display the image and the resulting regions. To easily integrate this HDevelop code into an actual application, it's recommended to structure the HDevelop code in a certain way. First, it's important to separate the visualization from the actual image processing. The visualization in HDevelop is usually used for debugging. It's not necessarily intended to be used directly in an application. In this example, we only want to integrate the machine vision part into our Visual Studio application. Therefore, we encapsulate these lines in a local procedure. First, we give it a name. Then we can check and adapt the input and output parameters. The image and minimum gray value go in, and the connected regions come out. Now, we can export this project. The main goal of this library export is to provide a wrapper function with all the required HDevEngine API code. When selecting Current Program, the local procedures of the current program are exported. Alternatively, you can export procedure libraries. Here, we want to integrate the code into a C++ application. Next, we can enter a project name and a namespace. Finally, we navigate to the directory of our existing Visual Studio project and then export. Let's have a look at the exported data. You can see the export has generated a CMake file. CMake is a cross-platform compiler-independent tool to manage the build process of software. It can be used, for example, to create a Visual Studio solution from scratch. Additionally, the export copied the used HDevelop program. Finally, in source, there is the exported wrapper code and a header file. That's what we will use for our application. Now, let's open the existing Visual Studio solution. I already prepared some steps for this application. To integrate Halcon, we first go to the project properties. Under C++, we have to specify 2 additional include directories. Moreover, under Linker, we have to specify an additional library directory. Last, we add 2 additional dependencies. Then, in the code, we include the header file for the Halcon C++ interface. Now let's define the variables. We read the same image as in HDevelop. Then we define the output region. Next, we add the 2 files in source we exported with HDevelop. Then we include the header in the code. Now let's integrate the machine vision we saw previously in HDevelop. Beginning with the namespace we chose, Visual Studio's Intelligent Code Completion shows us the available functionality. First, it's important to use setResourcePath to define where the respective HDevelop program is located. Here, it is in the directory HDevelop. Then, thanks to the exported wrapper code, we can simply write the procedure call just like an Halcon operator call. And that's all the code we need. Now we add a breakpoint and run the application. Using the Halcon variable inspect, we can have a look at the image and the resulting region. The Halcon variable inspect is included in the Halcon installation. Okay, Let's say that instead of all those regions, we only want these big regions here on top. Therefore, we go back to HDevelop and adapt the procedure. To do so, we use the feature histogram to select the required regions. We then save this program and restart the Visual Studio project. Note that recompiling is not necessary. In the Halcon variable inspect, we can see that the adapted code is already used. This concludes this introduction to using the library project export of HDevelop. You can download this application and try to extend it for your own use case. Thank you for watching.